Good afternoon. I think we're going to begin our oversight hearing. I'm expecting some other members to join us, but since we're not going to be taking any action today, that this is strictly informational, I will go ahead and begin the meeting. I have a few opening comments that I'd like to make before we begin. For the past 2 decades, legislators have had a vision of a comprehensive education data system that links pre-K, the K-12 system, and higher education data systems all together. This data system is critically important primarily for 2 reasons. One, to inform good policymaking, and 2, to inform instruction at the local level and in our schools. There is a potential for great benefits from this type of system, but there are also problems to overcome in moving to that comprehensive educational data system, including establishing the ability to track a pupil across each segment of their educational career, establishing linkages across the data systems that have existed in each of those segments, and building out new parts of the data system. It is one of those parts that we are building on that brings us here today, and that's the California Longitudinal Pupil Achievement Data Systems that we're going to refer to as CalPADS, is the K-12 foundation of this education data system, authorized by D.D. Alberts AB 1453 in 2002. CalPADS holds student-level data on demographics, program participation, and course completion. We've come a long way in implementing this part of the system. There was excitement about being able to identify individual student data using unique statewide student identifiers, about rolling out the CalPADS data collections, and about the kind of reports and analyses that will be available to us. However, the system has encountered some software problems, something that is not new to a large-scale IT project. The result of these problems was that Superintendent O'Connell sent a February 11, 2010 letter to county and district superintendents stating that, and I quote, "Due to unacceptable system performance issues that occurred during the rollout of CalPADS, I have directed IBM and the Department of Education staff to focus all resources over the next 2 months on stabilizing the system." At that same time, Superintendent O'Connell also halted all new work on CalPADS and suspended the contract procurement for the CalPADS, or the California Longitudinal Teacher Integrated Data Education System, known as CalTIDES. CalTIDES was authorized by Senator Simitian's SB 1614 in 2006 to serve as the central state repository of information on the teacher workforce, and will combine with CalPADS to provide comprehensive K-12 education data. So we have a data system that has been 2 decades from visions to implementation. We have 2 foundational components of that data system, CalPADS and CalTIDES. We have some problems in the implementation of one of those systems, and hopefully some work being done to address those problems. We will obviously have CalPADS delays that stem from these problems and repairs, and we have delays in the procurement and development of CalTIDES. That's the bad news. Hopefully we'll get some good news this afternoon. In today's oversight hearing, we have staff from both the Department of Education and the CalPADS independent oversight contractor, Sabot. Am I pronouncing that right?
Sabo.
Sabo. So it's French.
Yeah.
Sabo. From the independent oversight contractor, Sabot Technologies, to update the committee on the following issues. 1, issues that have been encountered in the implementation of CalPADS, the plan for addressing those issues, the implications for CalPADS' continued development and final implementation, and the implications for CalTIDES' contracting and development. And from the department, we have Carrick Ashley, who's the director of the Data Management Division. And from Sabot Technologies, we have Christopher Eves, who is the Chief Executive Officer. So welcome to both of you. Thank you for being here. and I will have you both begin, or one of you begin, and the next one to follow. Welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate the introduction, Senator Brownlee. You saved me about 7 minutes of my remarks. You did a good job summarizing where we are up until this point. Let me give you just a little bit more background. It was in January of 2008 in which we started our contract with IBM to produce for California for the first time ever a longitudinal student-level data system. That means a data system that's based on statewide student identifiers. Every public school student in the state of California, kindergarten through 12th grade is required to have an individual number, which we refer to as a statewide student number, or ID, statewide student identifier, SSID. And with that, districts will report to us by individual student, and then we will aggregate those reports, the reports that you often might see if you were to go to our website now and look up a report, say, under DataQuest, where you would get the number of students, or graduation rate, or dropout rate, and so forth. So for the first time, to build a statewide student longitudinal data system based on these SSIDs, they started in January of 0809. 0809 was our pilot year in which we tested the system. It went live in 2009-10, just earlier this school year. It's based on 4 basic data submissions. The first one is referred to as Fall 1, which is about student-level enrollment, graduation, dropout counts. Those are the basic elements of maintaining an SSID. Fall 2 is about course-level data, the courses that students take, the courses that teachers are teaching. The third data submission is called Spring 1, which is a count of English learners, an annual count of English learners and the services that they're receiving. And then the fourth data submission is called the end-of-year submission. We were very clever in our names, as you noticed. Fall 1, Fall 2, Spring 1, and then end-of-year, which, as you can imagine, comes at the end of year, in which districts report to us course completion. In this state, we've never had districts report to us how students actually did in the courses that they took through the school year. And so that is part of CalPADS to be implemented. So we released the first implementation of CalPADS was in August, in which schools access the system just to get the administrative functions going. There has to be one person identified in each local school district or independently reporting charter schools, of which there's about 1,500 when you add in the independently reporting charter schools. Every one of them has to have an administrative account, and they're the ones that decide within their local school district or charter school who will have access to the system. And so we need to provide a secure account for each person that's accessing the system. So that was done in August. The first rollout for districts to actually submit data to us was in October. That's what's referred to as Fall 1, the enrollment counts. And from the enrollment counts, we get exit information every time a student leaves a school or a district. A reason for that exit of that student is given, and it's from those exits that we are able to count graduates and dropouts. So shortly after that October release, it became fairly clear that there were problems with the system, performance issues, performance meaning that the system might work for a while, shut down, work for a while, not work slowly. So that has to do with performance. Along with performance, there were some defects in the system too, and when I say some, significant defects in the system that which is different than performance. A defect might prevent you from doing what you want to do, or a report might not accurately spit back to you the information that you're expecting it to. And so those are called defects, and there were problems both on the defect side and the performance side. So it was in about November that we asked our independent contractor, Sabo, to do a deep dive of the actual system itself, to take a look at the technology within the system and to look around at the processes that were being established around that system to see what they would find. So they did issue a report in January, and I think you're probably familiar with that report that SABO did. And in that report, there were a couple of things. Again, on the plus side, said the overall system architecture was sound, that how it was built was sound. That's on the positive. On the negative side, that there were some instability problems, performance issues. There was even a lack of discipline, if you will, in terms of the processes surrounding the program. And what we ended up into is a very bad cycle in which you're hurriedly trying to make fixes to a system so that school districts and charter schools can get fixes to the system and be able to report in a more efficient manner. But the more you hurry, the more chances that you create of creating other problems or even making current problems worse. And so the independent oversight also saw issues around that we needed to slow down, we needed to be more careful in putting out fixes to the system so that those fixes didn't create other problems in the system. From that, we took a very different approach. In February, as you mentioned, Superintendent Jack O'Connell sent out a letter to school districts, and we were very frank and upfront about the problems that we were having with the system, and wanted to make sure that school districts knew that we were aware of those systems and that we were putting to a halt any new functionalities into the system. Told IBM to stop. Go back, look at everything that they did with Fall 1 from top to bottom, retest everything. They did over 400 tests on that system, and you know, I can let SABO talk to that, but they did over 400 tests to the system to find the defects and to correct them. And so they did go back through and do all that testing for us. We did release on April 26th the results of those corrections. We were actually scheduled to do it at the very end of March, but the superintendent decided no, that IBM had done about 90 to 95% of what they were going to do as part of their plan to correct the system. And the superintendent decided no, we were going to wait until 100% of the plan was implemented before going out with that new release. And so we did go out with that new release at the end of April 26th. So that period of time you'll hear referred to as the stabilization plan. It was not anything new developed. We were to go back, and IBM was to retest everything that had already been done and to stabilize the system, to correct the defects, and to improve the performance. So we told school districts at that point in time that we would not set any deadlines for the submission of this data until we were positive, we had assurance that the stabilization plan that IBM presented to us was fully implemented and that the defects were corrected, so that when they did re-engage in the system, that it was a more efficient and more effective system for them to work with, because we certainly didn't want them being frustrated as they were early on with the number of performance issues that there were. But let me clarify that the system was never shut down, and sometimes, you know, news reports don't quite get everything 100% accurate, and certain words sometimes get used and misunderstood. The system was never shut down. It was always active. It was just not as efficient and as effective as it wasn't acceptable. But the system was open, and districts could use it to get their SSIDs. And some number of districts were in fact able to finish their enrollment counts all of Fall 1 and to certify their data. It wasn't a large number. It was over 100, but it was not a large, you know, in the scope of 1,500 LEAs that need to submit this data, it was not a large number. So we did that release on April 26th, and I think that's probably a good time for Chris Eves to give us an update of what happened from that release.
Great. Please proceed.
Sure. On April 26, 2010, the IBM team released the, quote, stability release, unquote, of the CalPAD system. This release contained over 200 fixes to Severity 1 and 2 defects, as well as numerous performance tuning improvements. With that release began a 60-day stabilization demonstration period during which CDE, with assistance from SABO Technologies, their oversight contractor, will continue to monitor and report on the performance of the system. In previous reports, such as CalPAD's architecture and process assessment that Sabo prepared on January 11, 2010, and the CalPAD stabilization progress report dated March 16, 2010, Sabo found and noted that the system stability issues were not associated with any gross design flaws, but rather were a result of the extraordinarily high rate of system defects and other quality-related issues. In turn, the root cause of the quality problems was found to be poor engineering processes. Sabo's prior reports made specific recommendations to correct the defects and to address the deficiencies in the engineering processes. The IBM response to the January 11, 2010 Sabo report was a focused quality improvement effort and a resulting stabilization release. The original date for the release was 3/29/2010. However, CDE determined that IBM had not met the previously defined GO criteria and made the executive decision to delay the release until the criteria were met. CDE conducted a second go, no-go decision process and subsequently authorized the release for April 26th. Since the April 26th release, the system has been operating with improved availability and effectiveness. There are also some areas that continue to be concerning. The following are the positive changes. The system has not experienced a significant slowdown or outage of the transactional functionality, the functionality that the LEAs use on a daily basis to report their data. The defect correction has enabled the LEAs to complete their work with fewer issues and greater efficiency and accuracy. There have been 20 LEAs who have completed their certification since the 4/26 release, bringing the total of Level 2 certifications to 173. The negative comments on the listserv have died down to a great degree. There are fewer service calls coming in from the LEAs, and the service desk is able to keep pace with these requests. There have been no Severity 1 defects since March 2nd. The following are the notable issues that remain. 25 Severity 2 defects have been reported since the April 26 release. While this number is disturbingly high, it is not beyond the ability of the IBM team to keep up with the fixes in the 3-week release cycle. In fact, 22 of the 25 are presently fixed and expected to be included in the next maintenance release. The week-over-week defect discovery rate has been going down, improving. So long as this trend continues, the system's stability should not be threatened. 16 of the 25 defects were discovered in the first week following the deployment. Should this trend reverse, however, it could surpass the team's ability to fix the defects and thereby risk an unstable system again. This is a metric being closely watched by all parties, IBM, CDE, and Sabo. Another mitigating factor when we consider the risks associated with the defects reported on the 4/26 release is that the breadth of the defects is small. That is to say that the negative effects of the defects are generally experienced by a small number of users. Item 2, an issue causing the failure of the nightly processing arose shortly after the 4/26 release deployment. IBM has identified the triggering conditions and has implemented a workaround, while the root cause and the permanent solution are being worked on. The workaround avoids the conditions that bring about the failure so that in the interim, no detrimental effects are experienced by the users. IBM is continuously monitoring this workaround to ensure that the condition does not reoccur. There's no foreseeable threat to overall system stability contained in this specific example. However, the incident points to a greater concern. The lack of clear governance over the operations and management of the technical environment is something that the teams must address. IBM has slated a configuration management expert to serve in a technical architecture position. CDE has identified this as a focus area for their project management to drive to resolution. As such, a specific effort to correct the operational and technical environment's governance gaps is underway. In conclusion, the testing and defect correction that IBM performed during the stabilization period has produced a system that is vastly more stable, better performing, and generally well accepted by the users. The system has not been in operation long enough to definitively determine the stability. However, despite a higher than expected level of new severity 2 defects, there are good signs that the risk of catastrophic system failure has been mitigated as the defect rate is decreasing and the scope of the defects is generally limited to a subset of users. Only further exercise of the system, monitoring of metrics, and close observation of the vendor performance over the next 45 days will allow a more deterministic assessment.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Okay, so I think, just to sort of what am I trying to say? Sort of on a more macro basis in terms of the contract with Sabot and with IBM. So you had said in your testimony that you had asked Sabot to look at this because you felt as though things weren't moving as quickly as they should, or for something must have cued you that there were problems, and so you asked Sabot to come in to take a look at it. So, and I guess, so if that's true, then I'm wondering where Sabot would, on the natural, be in their sort of oversight capacity of the overall project, what they would have done sort of on the natural. So I'm trying to understand whether, what occurred. You asked them to come, or Sabot said in their natural oversight indicated to you that there were problems?
Right, well, it probably would have, Sabot probably would have come to that conclusion independently from what they were seeing happening in the system. We are required to have what's referred to as an IV&V in this project, an independent verification and validation, which is an oversight contractor. And so they were already on board, in participating in meetings and watching performance. But we noticed early on that the system was not doing well, and so we made a specific request that they not just look at the overall project, but that they do, what we refer to as a deep dive, to actually look into the technology, not just how is the system performing, what are the metrics of success or failure in the system, but actually look into how it's designed to give their recommendation, because we wanted to make sure that there were not basic design flaws in the way the system was put together, the architecture, and that everything else was just going to be a Band-Aid on top of it. And so we wanted to make sure that they looked deep into the system to make sure that it was sound architecture, and that was what they concluded, though there were other issues to be looked at.
Thank you. And you had said, too, in your opening comments, you referred to a lack of discipline and the processes. What did you mean by that exactly?
Right. So project management requires that you have somebody who is looking at a schedule and looking at a work plan and making sure that certain processes are followed, including enough time to the design, enough time to put together how much resources it takes to fix something, and then a thorough testing of it before it actually is released to the public, in this case school districts, to use. And so if you shorten any of those things in order to get it out the door fast, in order to help people, you can actually create more problems than fixing. And so we just needed to be more disciplined, in some cases be more patient, to make sure that every step that we were taking to correct any defects, we're following basic project management standards in terms of taking the time to scope out the problem, assign resources, fix it, test it before it gets released.
Okay, thank you. I had a chance to review the Sabot documents, or the reports that were established the January 5th, and then the follow-up, I guess, the March 16th. And I must say, in hearing both of you speak relative to this issue, if I hadn't have read this in terms of what you just said, and I would think that things are pretty rosy, pretty good, worked out the problems, we're back on track again, the system never did come to a complete halt, and we're on track. And when I read these documents, that doesn't, I don't, I didn't walk away after reading those documents feeling that things were absolutely on track. I walked away saying that there's been progress, that Sabot identified areas of concern, and in almost every area in the beginning said, they recommended first that you stop the project, and then came up with recommendations in areas where there were problems, and their second report indicates that there's progress that has been made, but certainly indicates areas where more work needs to be done and more focus. It sounds like there's a new project manager that has been hired and some change with IBM, et cetera. But it is still, I'm not sure if we're back on track of the original timelines, how far behind we are. It sounds like from some of the letters that went out from the superintendent that we weren't going to go beyond the fall one, that fall two and spring and end of the year. None of that is happening right now. Anyway, without going, I can go through the report because I have the summary of recommendations here and start, asking some questions relative to that. But anyway, the two just didn't seem to join for me as.
Right. So perhaps I should have been just a little more thorough. The January report, the first one that you have in front of you, certainly had some information in it that was disturbing. We were glad that the system architecture was sound, but there were definitely some things pointed out from a resource standpoint. We didn't think I think the independent contractor didn't think that there were enough resources on the project. That, as mentioned here, the poor engineering processes or the lack of discipline, that was an area that the governance of the system wasn't at issue and still is something to be addressed, because we are working with, you have this one state agency, the State Data Center, which houses the data, and then you have the Department of Education, another agency to work with, and then you've got your contractor to work with, and then on top of that we do work with CSIS, California School Information Services, and they help us with the help desk. So there are a lot of pieces here, and the report pointed out that we need to do a better job coordinating so that we don't get mixed messages from one agency to the next. But from that January report is what prompted the superintendent's letter in February that said this is not acceptable. We're stopping anything new. We're going to go back and stabilize the system before moving forward. So that stabilization plan went into place. At about 2/3 of the way through that stabilization plan came the March report that Sabot did, and so you could see what the Sabot report in March said was, yes, there's been some good progress here. It's not complete. It's not finished. There's still some areas to work on. And so then we had the April release recently, and if you want to consider this testimony, if you will, a third or a second update to those first two Sabot reports, you will see that there's progress. I mean, they fixed over 200 defects, which means obviously there were significant issues with the system, and they've done significant work to correct them. It's not perfect, as Chris Eves' testimony says, that there are still 25 severity 2 defects were discovered even since that time, but 22 of them have been fixed. Do you want me to talk a little bit about?
Well, yeah, if you could just clarify the differences between severity 1 and severity 2. The report seems to indicate that both of them are pretty serious, but.
Yeah, they're both considered the most serious. Severity 1 is a complete system failure. Can't get in, can't work, can't do anything. Severity 2 is a specific failure with a specific piece of functionality. Can't do a task or run a report. So it's still major to whatever group of users is trying to use that function, but it's not system wide. It's more contained. And so that was the priorities were around those two areas.
Okay. So now if you go back to where you are on the checklist of severity 1 and severity 2.
Right. So there were 25, and 22 of them are ready to be fixed, and we're going out with a release on May 17th that'll fix those. And so any large system is going to continue to have defects, as it was mentioned in Chris Eve's report, that a lot of these, even severity 2 defects, can affect a small number of LEAs, but for them it's very critical, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that all school districts are having a problem with this one defect that needs to be fixed. So as long as those numbers keep decreasing, and as long as IBM can keep up with fixing them, then the system is considered stable. That's not out of that's not out of the norm for systems to have issues raised. The issue is how many of them are, and how quickly can you get them fixed and still keep your discipline, not hurry through the fixes, but keep your discipline and make sure that it's thoroughly tested before it's released to the public. Let me make one comment about what you had mentioned, because I failed to do that in my introduction, and that was we are finishing the fall one enrollment and graduation and dropout counts. Back in February, when the superintendent sent out that letter saying that the new functionality, the fall 2, spring 1, and end of year data submissions were being put on hold, we then went to some backup systems to collect that data for this school year, so that CalPADS wouldn't be relied on for this school year to do those other 3 data submissions of fall 2, spring 1, and end of year. Those are scheduled to be done next year for the first time through CalPADS.
Okay, so then, just in terms of timing then, based on what you just said, would it be fair to characterize that we're sort of a year behind then, that this, trying to figure out some of the glitches? Because I'm not sure exactly when fall 2 and...
Right, so fall 2 would have been done this year in the fall. Right. And spring and end of year. Right. So yes, for those data collections, we will be doing that 1 year later than we would have.
Right.
The enrollment data and the graduation and dropout data is done this year, and the criticality of that, of course, is that we're on track for the graduating class of 2010 for the first time to be able to report out a true four-year graduation rate and dropout rate based on those SSIDs following a student from 9th grade through the 12th grade. And so that enrollment and graduation dropout data is absolutely critical, and getting it in this year will continue to allow us to do those graduation rates in 2010.
So, and when do you think that, I know that there are still some elements that need to be worked out, and when are you intending on finishing that so that the system is, I understand that there's still nothing's going to be perfect at any moment in time, but in terms of making sure that you have a system of which you can build upon and continue to grow without stopping or going backwards. when do you think? Give me a sense of the timeline.
Right, that's a fair question. So when we did the release on April 26th, that was considered the completion of the stabilization plan, but there is a 60-day demonstration period that we put IBM on notice that we wanted to look at the system for the next 60 days to make sure that they demonstrate that the system is stable. So 60 days from April 26th, so over those 2 months, they'll demonstrate stabilization.
And then does Sabot are they overseeing that whole process? Because I don't know whether there's another report after the March report from Sabot. Because if there is, I haven't seen it.
I believe that's the last formal deliverable. There's this, we're continually involved in the project in our role as IVNV, Independent Verification and Validation. And the lead consultant on that effort who authored those reports is in contact with the team, almost every day, working with the team, keeping abreast of what's going on. I do not know if there's a plan to have a formalized deliverable at the end of that June 26th 60-day period, or if it's just going to be another statement like this, or how that needs to do. We'd be willing to author a report if that's what they want.
I see. So there's not really a structure by which
No,
you,
'cause
you
these are ad hoc.
report this out. It's just if you're asked or.
Because the original contract did not have these types of deliverables specifically called out, so we're doing them as ad hoc reports, basically. So, we're there to try to provide whatever advice and expertise we can. So we're trying to meet the expectations of the department and the state to give them whatever they need. So.
And it does seem reasonable at the end of the demonstration period to have an update to that report, because otherwise people are left with the last report that's public.
Right, right. But from your vantage point, based on where we are in this moment in time, do you feel, I can only go to the March 16th report and what your comments were that you addressed in your report then. Are you telling me that you believe that things are on track and moving forward, particularly in the areas, not so much this severity, severity 1 and 2, because I get that, but there were some other more kind of global issues, relative to management, relative to the expertise of IBM, relative to, things like that. And so I'm just kind of wondering where you
I'm once
see it.
removed from the project room. I have a lead consultant on that effort, Mr. Cippinelli. But my understanding, and working with him very closely, is that the original report of January and the update in March was pretty specific in identifying some engineering rigor that was lacking on the IBM side. Over the months, there has been some good efforts, not necessarily what we would have liked to have seen, but at least positive movement in certain areas, and they are getting better in some of those areas. Like I tried to convey in the statement, is progress seems to be happening. It's moving in a positive direction. Things are improving, but we really need to wait this full 60 days before we can make a final determination on if their increased engineering rigor has really paid off, in that the number of defects, the ability to address them in their testing, those types of things is really starting to come together. And it appears to be, but it's just early.
Okay, because and originally in the first report, in some sense, you kind of graded the system, based on in certain areas, and actually, one was technical architecture, which said gave it a grade of caution, which is potential danger of system. I mean, that sounds pretty. Not a score that we would like to have, and of course with both personnel and engineering processes, both of those were had the kind of the grade of stop, which is an indication of danger, critical danger of system failure, and then project management again with the scoring of caution, potential danger of system and project issues. So. But what I'm hearing is that you're feeling as though those areas were progressing and all of those particular areas. And at the end of this 60-day cycle, we would perhaps we would come back with another report, and perhaps we would have another scoring system that would give us some indication of the progress that we've made.
Well,
Go ahead.
I mean, I'm comfortable committing the firm to delivering a report in a similar format that kind of closes that out so that it's easy to follow.
Okay. And remind me again how much the contract is with IBM?
Right. So I assume what you want is what IBM is getting for this project and not what's going to the state data center. But IBM is getting $13 million, approximately $13 million.
Uh-huh. And how much have you spent so far?
Well, they haven't been paid in a while. I don't have an exact number in front of me, but they're paid on deliverables. And when we stopped Fall 2 and Spring 1 and end of year, which are deliverables, they basically stopped getting paid. So they have gotten some money because they've been working since January 2008, but it's been a while since they've gotten any payment from us because we're waiting for a demonstration of this deliverable.
Yeah. Can you give us based on what you know now, the progress that has been made so far, can you kind of give us a timeline where you are expecting all of this to be completed? Now, I know the kind of the data entry pieces, fall 2, spring, end of year, that's going to be pushed through to another year. But, when do you see, in essence, IBM completing their work, walking away from the project, where it's now in your hands, the system's up and running, you don't call IBM unless, there's some major problem again?
Right. So next school year, again, at the beginning of the year in October, we'll do our fall 1. Shortly thereafter, there'll be fall 2. In the spring, we'll do the spring, and then we'll have the end of year. Then at the end of year, which would be the last deliverable, there is a maintenance period in which basically the system is under warranty. I can't tell you the exact timeline, but it's generally a year that the system is under warranty and their maintenance. And during that time, there'll be a knowledge transfer in which they'll be working alongside of CSIS, California School Information Services, in which CSIS will then take over, along with CDE, the maintenance of the project.
Mr. Norby.
Normally, if a student transfers within the state or out of state, the incoming school that they're going into wants a transcript of the grades, right? And under this system, the parents wouldn't need to get a transcript and physically deliver it. The school would have access to this CalPads, right? And they would be able to get the entire record, correct? So is that working now, or it's still hoped?
Right. So the
soon?
more data that's in the system, the more data they'll have access to.
Okay.
Right?
It's not operational currently.
Well, to the amount of information that's in the system now, which is
okay. Now,
very
when I
basic.
transferred last fall, my kids transferred within Orange County to another school, and we got all the transcripts and they mailed them to the school. Now you're saying that they had some CalPads information, or did they even use it, or did they needed a physical transfer of the papers?
Right. So let me clarify. The official transcript is still done in paper, on paper, and transferred from one school district to the next. Through the use of the system, though, a school can get access to whatever information is in CalPads, which right now is limited to their enrollment history, certain demographics about the student, certain program participation, whether the student is special education or an English learner or a gifted and talented student. So there is some information they can get access to right away. In the future, once the data is in there, like after next year when they submit their grades and courses, then districts can get right away what courses they've taken the previous year and what grades they received for those courses.
If a kid, say he's 12 years old, disappears from the system, he was there for 12, say through 6th grade, and then 7th grade he didn't enroll in any school, does CalPads track that too? Or is that up to the individual district to figure out where the kid is, or they just assume he moved somewhere and didn't report or request a transcript, or how does that work?
Right. So it would depend on if a student actually shows up at someone's door. It may also depend on when the student leaves.
Leaves when school's out in June, just doesn't come back.
Right. And
maybe the parents moved to Texas, maybe they moved to Mexico, maybe
right. So
the kid died.
Right. So it depends on
maybe his kid's being homeschooled, private school.
Right. So it depends on what the parents have told the school at that point in time.
What if they told him nothing?
Okay. Then we don't know. The only time we would know.
Is it up to us to find out? I don't know if we should or shouldn't, but is it up to us to find out as the state, or does the school district aggressively go out and try to figure out what happened to the kid that's gone, or they figure that just didn't show up and so
right.
they're out of the system?
Right. So most sixth grade, most transitions, whether it's sixth grade to middle school or whether it's eighth grade to high school, most of those kids know what school they are intended to report to. So I know my kids are matriculating from sixth grade and they're going to go to Hughes Junior High School down the street. Well, the kid knows that. The school knows that I'm getting these kids from this local elementary school. So there may, in fact, be some outreach done by that middle school to find what happens to a student if they don't show up. But it's not necessarily going to happen in every case.
Mm-hmm.
But I would imagine that particular data point, it would say you don't know.
That's correct.
The other data points you would know, so it wouldn't get the unknown piece of information wouldn't make the rest of the data toxic in some sense.
Correct.
Because it would be isolated.
And what we would hope is that parents would tell the local school district, we're moving to Texas.
Right.
We're going to a private school.
You can't be
But you
accountable
can't.
for everything. Once the kid is graduated from high school or they're applying for college, is this information available to colleges? Would colleges want it? Would they be prevented from getting it? If a parent said, as part of an admissions officer at a university, could I request it and look at the whole thing, or is it confidential? Could I do it with parental permission, or is that, where are they with that?
Right. So any of the universities, and let me restrict for right now my comments to our public community colleges, CSU and UC. Since students are applying voluntarily for those institutes, there is an implied permission to get access to records because they're applying on their own, so they can get access to that information. CSU and UC have both put into their application systems. If you've had a son or daughter like I have in the last 3 years, you would see in their online application a place for the student to enter their statewide student identifier if they were a California.
Normally, they'd get the high school transcripts.
They would still get
They would
still get the transcripts.
The kid might not want the school to know that in sixth grade he dropped a M80 in the boys' room and the cops showed up and all that. I don't know if that's in the records or not, but
Right. So
at a certain point he might not want them to go all the way back to kindergarten.
Sure.
And CalPADS has that, right?
If they had an M80
Correct.
at that
So, but
kindergarten.
but the CSU and UC don't necessarily reach back for all those records. They are looking for the official transcript, which goes from the high school onto the universities.
All right. Thank you.
Yes. So just again, to understand all the moving parts to complete CalPADS, is IBM as part of it, Sabot as part of it. Are there any other contracts, any other folks that you're contracting with to sort of complete this process? You had an outside person, I think, on contract that now is an in-house person. Is that correct? Based on
Well, yes, we have a project manager who is on contract, yes,
okay.
that represents
And
CDE.
who is that?
That's Daniel Conway.
And he's just an individual?
He's an individual.
Okay, not from a
I
company.
mean, he's part of a company, but
Right, okay. But that's it?
yes.
Okay. And then on the whole CalTIDES issue, you've stopped everything on CalTIDES. Can you bring us up to
Right. So
speed on that?
So I think it was in February, at the same time when the superintendent notified the school districts that we were putting a halt onto any new functionality to CalPADS, that there was also a notification sent to IBM notifying them that we were putting the CalTIDES contract on hold, that it wasn't being signed at this point in time, because how it's designed now is for our teacher data system to work in concert with, basically on top of, if you will, the CalPADS system. And so we certainly didn't want to build one system on top of another if the bottom system is not stable. So we were waiting for the stabilization plan to be implemented and for the 60 days of demonstration period to end before we moved forward with that CalTIDES contract with IBM. So right now that is on hold.
And what about CalTIDES data collection?
So CalTIDES is also an individual level student, not student, but an individual level data system in which every public California teacher or administrator has their own unique ID. Like an SSID, we call it an SEID or a SEED, a statewide educator ID, and that ID is issued by our California Commission for Teacher Credentialing. So as soon as they get some paperwork from a teacher who is interested in applying for a position, or I'm sorry, a credential or an authorization, then CTC issues them one of these SEIDs or SEEDs in order to keep track, again, longitudinally, something we've never had before. So this is the second year that we've now moving into the second year of having these statewide educator identifiers. That system does not collect data from school districts. The California Department of Education collects data on teachers through CalPADS. So through CalPADS, districts do tell us which teachers are teaching, what they're teaching, and then what we would do is we would take this identifier, this SEID, send it to CTC, and we would get all the credentialing and authorization information directly from CTC rather than asking school districts to report it to us. So the CalTIDES is more is not about collecting data from school districts. It's about sharing data between state agencies and eventually employment data that we can then provide reports back to school districts or to the public or to stakeholders about what teachers are authorized to teach and how they're being assigned. And it's especially critical now that we're moving into a very significant area of school improvement. And looking at reform within schools. And so looking at teacher qualifications is extremely important. And CTC has a lot of information that the California Department of Education has never had access to, in that we never had these individual identifiers. CTC has information about pre-service programs, where a teacher went to get credentialed or where they got authorizations from. You know, how many courses do they have in certain areas that qualify them to teach. And so it's a richness of information that's never been available before, but now will. And then, of course, we collect what they're teaching, because CTC only does the credential side of it. They don't know what teachers are teaching, and we do that. So we can also, through this SEID, track things like where teachers move throughout the state, the retention of teachers that are participating in certain professional development programs, how long are those sustained for, and what are the results, student results of teachers that have gone through certain professional development programs. So that's kind of the promise of CalTIDES.
So, but on CalTIDES, you're still, I understand that there's data in different departments and trying to, bring that data together. But what I hear you saying is that if we wanted to answer a certain policy question, or we wanted to inquire on a specific question, because we now have this identifier, we can go to the various departments and collect this information and provide that data. So, as opposed to saying, okay, now we have a teacher identifier, and we want to collect so much information in particular fields, like we're going to do for students dropout, et cetera. So you're not going to collect, why a teacher left the profession, or what they were doing before they became a teacher, or certain fields of information that I think would also be helpful relative to answering policy questions. And as you said, moving forward in terms of looking at performance, and obviously teacher effectiveness is a big conversation going on. And I'm just so
right. So what we would have access to is information about the length of teachers teaching. What we don't know are the answer to the why questions, right? So that would still take probably an independent evaluator to actually take a subset of which we could provide the data to start with, to say, okay, here's the number of teachers that started after 2005 and left California school districts after only 3 years. so then an evaluator could take that information and rather than have to look at the whole state and do surveys, we could narrow the field for them, which would allow them, assuming that they were, under contract to us and we weren't violating any personal FERPA violations or individual violations, they could take that data and find out why. Why are we not retaining teachers? So that's not normally done on an annual data collection.
But, I mean, a big difference between CalTIDES and CalPADS, at least from what I'm hearing, is that in CalPADS we're going to collect a certain amount of information on students, and we've sort of predetermined what those kind of data sets that we want. And with CalTIDES, that's not necessarily, we're not doing the same thing, even though the data would be coming from departments and not being collected from schools.
Right. So there's actually quite a bit of teacher data that's collected through CalPADS. So it wouldn't have to be in CalTIDES. So if we need to collect data on teachers from school districts, we would get that through the CalPADS system.
Okay. Okay. So another question that I had relative to kind of the system potentially having some delays, and it sounds like that there will, in terms of the CalPAD system being up. Questions about federal compliance with No Child Left Behind, and where are we with that? And then just the other question too, if No Child Left Behind changes through the reauthorization and so forth, is the CalPAD system flexible enough to change if the federal government requirements and reporting requirements were going to significantly change?
So data systems are probably never done. And this system is the same way. One of the advantages of collecting data at a student level is that if there was a new requirement from the federal government, let's say attendance was one of those, or if there was a requirement to find out which students take a bus to school, and we've never had that before. In the past, of course, we'd have to come up with a new data collection with a new matrix, and depending if you wanted to know if you wanted those kids by gender and by race and ethnicity and by grade level, then you'd end up with this big matrix that you would send out to schools and have them complete. Whereas now in a student level data system, it could be as easy as just a flag in the system where, does the student take the bus or not? Now, that's probably the easiest collection. Sometimes you need to know, do you need to know start dates, end dates, how long did they take? Do you want to know if they were 3 hours on the bus versus less than an hour? So there's a lot that it could be, but sometimes it's as simple as just one flag indicating that they're participating in some program or not. And so yes, the system can do that. It would have to, how the process would work is one, let's assume it's a federal requirement so that we don't have to talk about state mandate issues. So let's say there's a new federal requirement. We would scope that out. What exactly does adding this to the system mean? Is it just one flag, or do you need start date, end date? How much information do you need? So you scope it out. You hand it over to IBM right now. In the future, you'd have your technicians either at CSIS or CDE, work on that and scope out, okay, so what's it going to cost to add this element to the system, and then you'd come back with a report and say, okay, this is how much time it takes and this is the resources it takes. Do you really want to do it or not? Because there could be some costs involved, and this is the amount of time that it would take. So the system can accommodate changes in the future, but it has to be through one of those disciplined processes and not something that's done quickly.
And how is it going in the field in terms of data collection? And entry, I guess I should say.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have had a number of districts that have certified their data since this new release on April 26th. We have two kinds of listserv out there. And a listserv, there's a one-way listserv and a two-way listserv. One-way listserv allows us to shoot out an email, a notice to every user of the system to give them updates. A two-way listserv, which some of you may be participating in your own Yahoo news groups or whatever you want to call them, that allows individuals to basically talk to each other through this system. So someone might post a question and say, I'm having a problem with this, and then others might reply to it. So it's a two-way in which districts can talk to each other. So we monitor that listserv. We don't control it. We generally don't post information to it unless we see something that's wildly inaccurate. It's mostly for school districts, people to talk to each other and sometimes allow them to help each other. Sometimes they do vent when they're having frustrations. Sometimes they congratulate each other on certifying their data. So we keep a tab on that because it does give us a bit of a pulse as to what's happening out there. So early on, of course, it was one of the things that was very active, and there were negative comments about how the system is working or not working and that sort of thing. Since the stabilization, I think it was even in the report that Chris Eves gave, was that the listserv chatter, if you will, the comments, the negative comments are way down. So the activity seems to be more of an acceptance of the system, that this is working much better than it was before. Not perfect, there are still issues, but it's much better than it was before, and it's certainly a system that's workable. Now, we haven't set deadlines yet for school districts, so we still have a small number of LEAs, 100 and some, that have certified their data. Looking at the data within the system, there's another 150 that could certify tomorrow, meaning that they have no errors in their system and they don't have any, they have a small number of anomalies in the system, so they could certify their data. They're just waiting. So we think it's time now, very shortly here, to release a deadline to them to give them a target to shoot at. And as you know, what human nature is, whatever the target is, that's what you put your work around. And so we think it's time now that they'll accept, because the system is working better, they'll accept a deadline and start working towards it. So what we anticipate is that more districts will certify their data once they know that there's a target date out there for them to meet.
Okay. Welcome, Mr. Amiano. Do you have any questions? No. Nope? Okay. No. All right. Well, I think, just sort of in conclusion of this hearing is, want to get some commitments and understandings about, sort of next steps in terms of how we're doing. So, we talked about sort of the expenditure plan. If you could share that with us, how much we have spent to date and where we are with that. And then I think you have committed to, after we finish the 60-day period, that the department and SEBO would get together and give us another report and tell us where we are relative specifically to the issues that were raised in previous reports, and give us some kind of similar scorecard that you gave before. Then timelines just relative to adjusted timelines relative to the completion of CalPADS, CalTIDES, what that time frame is going to be. And I know that it's been probably well over a year that McKinsey did some work for the department as well in terms of next steps relative to data. Any other plans that you have after sort of the completion of this in terms of linking other data sets, and sort of where we're going? But I haven't been here for that long, but I served as chair of Budget Sub 2 my first 2 years here, and I know we spent a lot of time on this particular issue and relative particularly to timelines, because we've been anxious to move along in this process, and it's been slower than we all would like, and I know that includes the department as well. But if we could just kind of look at some new timelines so that we have the ability to track that would be I think would be very helpful.
That'd be great. Could I make just one more comment?
Absolutely.
So in a system that's this large, and I don't want to place all of the emphasis just on IBM. We do have our state data partners, OTEC at the State Data Center, and then of course
what is
OTEC.
OTEC.
Yeah. So that's where that data is housed. And then, of course, you have the actual software that IBM does. And then in local school districts, you've got their local student information system software that they've got to get data out of that system in order to get it into CalPADS. So it's important that none of those three break down, because any of those breakdowns causes a problem with getting data into the system. So while we have some level of control over what happens at the state level with OTEC and what happens with IBM and IBM software, we have much less control over the 13 to 15 different local student information systems that school districts use to extract the data out of their system in order to import it into CalPADS. Now, we have been working with them since the very beginning, showing them what the file specifications are and how they should be ramping up their systems in order to help school districts do this. But some school districts are having problems at the local level, and some software companies locally are more accommodating than others and more service-oriented than others, and you actually have some software systems that are dying products that the vendor is not going to support as well because they want to put their money toward their new product. And so we do have some school districts that are struggling with their data, not because of necessarily of IBM or the CalPADS system, but because of their own local issues. So if you'll indulge me in just a quick commercial for AB 2265, it's a solace bill. It's what the superintendent has been advocating for the last 4 years, which is some ongoing money for local school districts in order to do data activities, because data are not free. If we want accurate data and we want good data, then we ought to help school districts provide it to us, and they need resources to do that. And so whether those resources are used for personnel or for hardware or for software or for training, because there's a great amount of turnover that happens in schools, and in order for this data to be accurate, it means that 10,000 schools in our state are doing it correctly. So we think ongoing support at the local level for school districts is absolutely critical. It's a very bad combination to make high-stakes decisions on low-quality data.
Thank you. And we did pass that bill out of this committee, and I believe it's in appropriations now. So
Thank you for your
hopefully it will move from appropriations. So I think if anybody else doesn't have, and if nobody has any more questions, Ms. Carter, do you have any questions? I think that we'll conclude, and with the commitment to, you will bring this additional information before us. If there's anyone in the audience that wants to make a comment, I would welcome that. There might be a question that we might not have asked. Seeing no one wants to make a comment, then I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here.